Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup. This for the week of the 19th to 25th of April 2021. I'm Blaine Curcio, joined as always by my co-host Jean Deville. Before getting into our news updates this week, a special shout out to our good friends at Go Taikonauts and Spacewatch.global, two excellent sources for space industry news. This week, we bring you some statements from the president of China Satcom, some results of an experiment of a satellite that was built by Spacety with some help from Nanjing Intane, an industrial base from yet another commercial launch company in China. But first, Jean is going to bring us an update from a major conference held in Nanjing this week, the China Space Day Conference.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome you aboard the Dongfang Hour. Please make sure your seatbelt is securely fastened. Thank you.
士们、先生们，预计空中飞行时间2小时15分钟，我们预计在当地时间下午6点25分左右到达。
So, Jean, what's going on at China Space Day?
Sure. So, first of all, happy China Space Day, everyone. China Space Day took place last Saturday, and this celebration basically promotes China's space heritage and China's future space missions. And China Space Day is actually not just one event. It's really hundreds of events all around the country that are organized by research institutions, by universities, by schools, and they are all organizing space outreach events. And this is, for example, presentations, conferences, exhibitions. And it's clear that this event here, China Space Day, is meant to foster the curiosity and the interest of the younger generations towards China's space achievements and towards just space sciences in general. And we also saw quite some cool space stuff on social media, such as drawing contests, space artistic performances, this sort of stuff. And it's worth noting that while you have all these events going on all around China, there's actually only one main China Space Day official event, which this year takes place in Nanjing, the capital of Jiangsu province. Every year it takes place in a different city. Last year was Fuzhou, and I think the year before was Changsha. And so this is a place where the Chinese space industry, creme de la creme, they get together during 2 days. And you have, for example, so you had some speeches from some pretty high-level people, such as Zhang Kejian, the director of CNSA. We had Wu Zhenlong, the governor of Jiangsu. We had Han Lingming, the secretary of the Nanjing Communist Party. There was also some award distribution ceremonies, some presentations on the space industry, panels, exhibitions, and videos on China's space achievements, all of that. And you can really perceive, I think, through China Space Day, the pride the Chinese people have for their space program. And a lot of the official materials tend to instill this feeling, I think. And if we take a look, for example, at the official China Space Day clip released by CNSA, it's quite suggestive of this. And I'll just put a few extracts up here on the video. And so there would be quite a few things to unpack here, and just a couple points I want to note on this video. First of all, as you would expect, it highlights a lot of China's space achievements in the last year. Just the last 365 days, you had, for example, the completion of the Beidou constellation. You had the Chang'e 5 lunar sample return mission. You had the maiden launch of Long March 8. You have the ongoing Tianwen 1 Mars mission. So you have the next generation crewed vehicle. You do realize that, you do have a lot of things going on in China currently in space. That was just some of the things in the last 365 days. The video also highlights future Chinese space missions, the fourth phase of the China lunar space program, so Chang'e 678, the asteroid sample return mission, the heliosphere probes, this sort of thing. And probably one of the more interesting things also in this video is the message that you see at the end of the video. It says self-reliance, homegrown innovation. So 自力更生,自主创新, which is certainly a push for innovation. But I think you also get through that message how, first of all, how decoupled the Chinese space industry is with other countries. First point. And I think the second point is also how China is wary of relying too heavily on any third-party country, non-Chinese country, on providing any significant space systems. And this, understandably, and I mean, you have this phrase here, self-reliance. So yeah, I think that's one of the big trends currently going on in China, not just in space, but just more generally. Yeah.
Definitely, and I do think that the China Space Day has certainly been used as a showcase for all of the most patriotic elements of the Chinese space industry and the Chinese space program. I remember in 2018 going to the China Space Day at Hagongda at the Harbin Institute of Technology. They had a big Tiangong 2 model outside of the exhibition center, and I just think back to that 3 years ago, that conference when. Seeing the CEO of Landspace, Roger Zhurong, give a speech in a pretty kind of rather shabby auditorium with maybe 80 people, although it was standing room only, and just thinking, wow, we've come a long way here in the Chinese space sector in just these 3 years. So to your point about outreach, I think I definitely agree that we've seen a lot more kind of popular awareness of the Chinese space sector, and just this. I don't know if it's necessarily a conscious sort of strategic attempt, but it does seem that there's an attempt by the space program to kind of inspire people in some way and to get them feeling like there's a lot of amazing accomplishments going on by the Chinese space program, which is correct. I guess it's more to get them to realize that. So one thing that I thought was quite interesting was the official poster for this year's China Space Day. So traditionally we see these pretty oftentimes kind of jazzy or kind of I guess 2 years ago was a psychedelic kind of Chang'e poster. But, usually they're very spacey. They're very, they're either emphasizing the rockets or the satellites or some celestial bodies. And this year it was just I guess, father-daughter combo on a nice green hill, and they have a telescope and they're looking up at the sky. There's a Long March 5 and there's Chinese space station, and on the ground you see some observatories. So it really just seems that there's a lot more, I guess, awareness of the extent to which space has an ability to inspire regular people, and there's this really, I think, an attempt to cultivate that. I think to really link the Chinese space program to some degree of national pride, which I think bodes well for the future of the space program. I think it gives it more soft power, if you will. So one last point I think about the China Space Day conference from my side. So we did see an announcement that the name of the Chinese Mars rover, which is currently on board the Tianwen-1 spacecraft that's in orbit around Mars, the name is going to be Zhurong, which was announced by the CNSA. So Zhurong being the god of fire in Chinese mythology, and it's a good that's a solid name. But as you may recall on Dongfang Hour episode, I do not remember, but we can put it in the show notes. We did show the 10 different names that were being voted on, and I still think Qilin and Zhuimeng were preferable, but Zhurong is not bad. So anything else, John, from your side on China Space Day, or shall we move into some... Okay. So this week we also saw some statements made by the president of China Satcom, so Ge Yujin, and so these statements were made at a shareholders meeting for the company and reported by Chinese satellite industry news source Satellite World, Weixingjie. And they were reported on Monday, which would have been the 19th of April. And so I think the most important takeaway from these statements made by ChinaSat President Ge were this idea of there is a very large change happening to Hongyan and also to Hongyun, was essentially what was said at this press conference. So he basically, to give a little bit of context, he was asked a question by a reporter about the Hongyan constellation, which is kind of under the purview of China Satcom to some extent. They're a shareholder. And asking, it was meant to be finished in 2020, and what's here we are in 2021, kind of what's the situation. And again, Mr. Ge, he noted that it had a large change over the course of, I guess, recent months or so. So this, it seems to imply that, well, first off, I think that one of the interesting things to note about these statements is that Hongyan and Hongyun were used in the same sentence under the idea of reorganizing the country's national LEO constellation plan. So As we most recently speculated on the Dongfang Hour News episode 27, China's LEO ambitions are likely to consolidate these two constellations, Hongyan and Hongyun. So they are both broadband constellations under CASC and CASIC, respectively, and they are likely to merge into a Guowang constellation, which we discussed all the way back on Dongfang Hour News episode 1, while leaving Xingyun, a separate CASIC constellation, to develop separately as a sort of Chinese iridium. And this seems to be what China Satcom President Ge is implying, that there's going to be these big changes to the country's broadband constellations, and that they're going to potentially merge. I think also noteworthy about this is that it kind of calls into question the role of China Satcom in this whole broadband constellation project. So China Satcom is the national satellite operator of China. They have what is effectively a monopoly. There are other satellite operators, but they all basically need to sell through China Satcom. And they have not up to this point developed very many kind of broadband applications due to the market conditions in China. And so it's not clear to me that China Satcom would be a huge value add to a LEO broadband constellation, but being the sort of national satellite operator of China, it would seem that China Satcom would have a role, fairly significant role to play. And the fact that the president is making such statements about Hongyan and also Hongyun seems to imply that China Satcom has some level of involvement in the constellation. So one last point, and then I'll turn it over to you, Jean. So just the mention of K6 Hongyun is quite interesting to me. So as we've discussed on previous episodes, CASC and CASIC don't get along particularly well, and China Satcom being a CASC subsidiary and Hongyun being a CASIC subsidiary, you basically have a China Satcom president saying we're going to be absorbing that CASIC subsidiary into some larger constellation plan. So I do think it's an interesting thing to see that used in the same sentence. And I also would point out that the new-ish chairman of CASIC, Yuan Jie, is a former CASC executive, so we may see some increasing activity between these two companies. And so I don't know what to necessarily expect there, but it was nonetheless interesting to see such a high-level CASC executive mentioning CASIC in such a direct way. So, Jean, any takeaways from your side on these China Satcom discussions?
Yeah, so firstly, I definitely agree with you. It's interesting to see such a high-ranking official, space industry official. So here we're talking about the president of China Satcom. Typically, I think this level of people would be aware of the backdoor discussions that are currently taking place on Hongyun and Hongyan, and so him discussing those two topics in the same sentence, same response, it does sort of I think confirm to some extent the speculation that we were having on the consolidation of these two constellations. And there's definitely an intrigue on the role that China Satcom will play in this future Guowang constellation, because I mean, on paper, as you mentioned, they're the main satellite operator in China for communication satellites, and so you'd expect them to play a role in the future LEO broadband constellation. But the speculation that we've been hearing, and notably, for example, last year, the setup of this state-owned enterprise that would be dedicated to operating the Guowang, this broadband constellation. It seems that this state-owned enterprise involves very little China Satcom people, and that this would be something that would be rather more independent and directly under SASAC, so this government entity that manages China's more important state-owned enterprises. So yeah, I think there's a big question mark here on what role China Satcom will play on China's future satellite internet infrastructure.
And I guess just thinking out loud here with one last point, and then we can take it on to Spacety and Intane. So just this idea that in the West, the most successful LEO mega constellations thus far, that being, let's say, Starlink and OneWeb, and the rest have not. Anyway, none of them have really been involving a traditional geostationary satellite operator that much. I mean, Intelsat was a relatively small shareholder in OneWeb at one point. And you have SES with their MEO constellation O3b, but really it certainly would make sense for China Satcom to be the operator of this constellation, but at the same time there's nothing in the West that seems to indicate that traditional geostationary satellite operators are very capable of moving into this business, I think. But so yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out for sure. But yeah, I think you can take us on to Spacety and Intane, John, if that's
Yeah, I think what you just pointed out is a really good point. Moving on to another topic linked to China's satellite internet infrastructure, we saw an interesting piece of news this week coming from two Chinese private companies. So Spacety, basically a satellite manufacturer, and Intane Optics, an optics subsystem manufacturer. These two companies, they announced in a press release in early April that they had achieved China's first private satellite-to-ground laser comms experiment. And so, as usual, before digging into this news, some background on these two companies. Spacety is one of the fast-moving private Chinese satellite manufacturers. They mainly build CubeSats and small sats, and I think they've launched about 20-ish of these since the company was founded in 2016. And Intane Optics, on the other hand, they're, first of all, they're a China Academy of Sciences spinoff. They were founded in 2003. They're based in Nanjing, and basically they manufacture optical instruments, historically more linked to astronomy, but we've seen them diversify into laser communications over the past few years. And now back to this news. This satellite-to-ground experiment basically was done with Beihang Sat-1, which is a satellite we mentioned sometime in November last year. And so this is a Spacety CubeSat, basically that essentially it's a test satellite for space-based ADS-B, so an experimental satellite for air traffic control. But it also had an auxiliary payload called the SG-10-1. And this was an optical payload provided by Intane Optics, and Intane Optics also provided the optical ground station in Nanjing. And so with this infrastructure, you have Spacety and Intane, which started a batch of laser comm tests starting in December 2020. And up to early April, the time of the press release, apparently they have achieved over 50 laser communication experiments. And according to the press release, these experiments were conducted under different meteorology conditions, and they aimed at, quoting them here, evaluating beam tracking performance, analyzing the impact of atmospheric turbulence on communications, and testing downlinking of remote sensing data. And I think this is significant news for several reasons. So first of all, while this is not China's first satellite-to-ground laser comms experiment, there were only a handful of these so far, and all of them so far were done by state-owned entities. So typically research institutes and universities. And so this is the very first time that you have two private companies working together on this technology. And I think to some extent, this is really an impressive first sign of the commercialization of, first step into commercialization of this, satellite to ground laser comms technology, which is still considered by many to be quite an early stage technology. And I think that this is also a technological feat because, laser comms is not something that's easy. You need to have the ground station with the telescope, with the tracking mount that points really specifically at the LEO satellite that's moving quite fast in low Earth orbit. You also have to have the optical terminal on the satellite. You need to have this laser beam point, precisely at the ground station. And once you have this interlock, you also have other problems that come up. You can have clouds blocking your signal. You can have atmospheric turbulence, deteriorate your signal. You can have background light, for example, impact your signal. So a lot of things can go wrong. And so definitely good on Spacety and Intane Optics for working on such challenging technology. And I think last point here I want to mention before passing it on to Blaine is that the press release by Spacety and Intane Optics, it also mentions China's satellite internet infrastructure. And this is interesting. It brings us to our previous point. The Guowan constellation, this huge 13,000 satellite constellation, is based on radio frequency waves. There's nothing optical about it. And so there's the question of, does laser comms have a role to play in China's future laser comms, future satellite internet infrastructure as, maybe Spacety and Intane Optics seems to suggest. And so from the point of view of the Guowan constellation, probably no. But then the answer globally overall in China is probably yes, because you have the 14th five-year plan a couple weeks ago that revealed that China was planning to have a number of quantum satellites in orbit over the next 5 to 10 years. So we will definitely see something with satellite laser comms, despite it not being directly in this huge LEO Guowan constellation.
Indeed, and just a couple of very small points to add about Spacety and Nanjing Intane, and then one other anecdote, and then we can move on to our last bit of news. So yeah, to your point about just the difficulty of this type of technology and this type of test. I mean, I think it is a testament to how advanced some of China's most advanced commercial space companies are at the moment. So Spacety, for example, I mean, they're now about 6 years old, but even prior to their founding, which is into about 2015, they were a team inside of the CAS for about 3 years before that. So this has basically been the same team, the same core team of people building satellites for almost 10 years now. You also have Nanjing Intane, which is almost 20 years old, also from the CAS. So you're really starting to get, I think, this maturity of companies and this ability to collaborate to do really quite cutting-edge things. So the last point to add on this update is so we have, as John mentioned, it involves an observatory in Nanjing. We also have Nanjing Intane, which is a company that is from Nanjing. We also have the China Space Day this week in Nanjing, and we've also had, a bit less recently, but still in the last 6 months, Galaxy Space and Deep Blue Aerospace moving over to Nantong, Jiangsu. So I would just point out that, Jiangsu appears to be kind of a trending topic these days in the Chinese space sector, as are several other provinces that are perhaps not so traditionally associated with the sector, but that are now really attracting a lot of companies. And so our last piece of news on the week, it continues along with this Jiangsu trend. We have Tianbing Aerospace announcing an intelligent rocket manufacturing base in Zhangjiagang district of Suzhou. And so Tianbing Aerospace, aka Space Pioneer, they held a signing ceremony this week for this intelligent rocket manufacturing base. And so just a couple of points about Tianbing Aerospace and then some details on the signing. So Tianbing is one of the newer Chinese launch companies. They had a couple of different rounds of funding last year. They've kind of come out of nowhere, let's say, over the last 18 to 24 months. And the manufacturing base, it includes a total investment of about 4 billion RMB. It's not entirely clear how, where that money is coming from. And it aims at having a capacity of 30 liquid rockets and 300 engines per year, with an estimated completion date of next year. So a few other interesting points from the article of this very ambitious satellite manufacturing base. So Tianbing Aerospace plans to launch its first Tianlong liquid carrier rocket by the end of 2021, which, according to an exhibition shown at the signing ceremony, would make Tianbing the first medium-sized liquid-fueled rocket in China. The company also claims to have pre-sold 10 rockets so far, and they plan to begin batch manufacturing by next year. Tianbing also plans to IPO before the end of 2023, and not mentioned in the article, although mentioned briefly earlier, is that they have been a quite aggressive fundraiser. They actually had raised 3 rounds of funding in 2020. It does not seem that they raised any money this week at the time of the announcement. It seems like it was just the signing for this intelligent rocket manufacturing base in Suzhou. So overall, pretty interesting update from one of China's sort of younger, let's say, commercial launch companies. I think it's worth noting that this is yet another rocket industrial base, in addition to the 8 or so commercial rocket industrial bases that we mentioned a couple of weeks ago. So anything to add, John, from your side on Tianbing, aka Space Pioneer? Space Pioneer.
Yes, I think Tianbing is a really interesting Chinese rocket company to bring up, and so you've alluded a little bit to its history, and as mentioned, it's one of the latecomers of the Chinese launch landscape. It was founded in 2019, I believe, so that's really way after some of the earlier Chinese pioneers in private launch, such as Link Space, Land Space, OneSpace. All these companies were founded sometime between 2014, 2015, maybe even 2016. And so, I mean, that's probably a clear disadvantage, but we're seeing a lot of things happening with Tianbing. Another thing that's interesting also, it's its founder, Kang Yonglai. He's the current CEO, and he was historically the CTO of Land Space, and he left Land Space in 2018. Presumably because he had his own ideas of how to make rockets. And I think that leads us to the more interesting point of Tianbing, which is that they're really fascinating from a technological point of view. They've chosen a novel approach to propulsion using what they call HCP green propulsion for its Tianhua engines. So the Tianhua engines are the engines that power Tianbing's Tianlong 1 rocket. And so what this is actually, HCP propulsion is a a blended monopropellant. So what a monopropellant is basically it's a chemical component or an assembly, a blend of chemical components that is able to react with itself. So typically it can be decomposition. And so this chemical reaction generally generates a highly exothermic reaction, and this produces thrust. And this is an amazing property when you think of it. Monopropellants would mean that you don't have two fuel tanks. You don't have one fuel tank for, say, a liquid kerosene, and another one for liquid oxygen. You just have one tank with the monopropellant that just reacts with itself. So you have less weight. You just have one big tank. You also have more simple turbopump systems because you don't have to deal with two different fluids that have two different densities. So it's lighter weight, so more simple turbopump system. It probably means also that it's higher reliability because there are less components. So that's probably a very good point as well. And last point also is that this HCP fuel apparently is storable. So you don't have to fuel your rocket at the last moment, as you see is the case for rockets that use liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen, and liquid methane typically. So all these are definitely great advantages. And on paper, HCP monopropellant looks amazing. And I think if it was used notably as a propellant for the main stage engine, that would actually be a world first, because I think monopropellants so far have only been used in some of the upper stages or also as in-orbit maneuvering propulsion systems. And also, I think that HCP would be an amazing replacement for the most common monopropellant that you see, which is hydrazine. It should have much higher specific impulse from what I understand. And also interesting, I think this is the more important point, is that HCP monopropellant would not have the high toxicity of hydrazine. And you can typically see that spacecraft that use hydrazine-related propellants, I mean, for example, the X-37B, you have these videos of these people that are in full, pressurized life-supporting systems and suits when they are close to the rocket. So definitely don't have that issue. And I think that's why HCP monopropellant is called HCP, it's called a green propellant. So yeah, all that looks very good. Now, I do have a tiny bit of skepticism on the company, and I've also heard some people mention the same thing, linked notably to its timeline, because as Blaine mentioned, so this company is planning to have a first launch in 2021. It was founded in 2019. And if they want to base their entire rocket on this type of HCP monopropellant, this is very ambitious, because you don't have the 60 years of experience that mankind has dealing with Kerolox or Hydrolox, although it's not exactly 60 years. And also, even Methalox. I mean, Methalox is something that's new, but at the same time, it's much closer to what we know and what we understand. And so Tianbing would have to base, the engineering of the turbopumps, the combustion chamber, the ignition systems, or the catalytic systems, all of this, based on their own research. There's not much research that was prior to this. So yeah, I have doubts, but then on the other side, as you mentioned, Blaine, this company is raising a lot of money. They seem to have the confidence of the investors. We do see some cool videos of Tianbing testing their Tianhua 123 rocket engines. So hey, you might be surprised. And this guy, this CEO Kang Yonglai, he does have a strong background from land space as a CTO, and also some background from Calt as well. So he probably knows what he's talking about. So yeah, this will be one of the more interesting rocket companies to follow in China.
I mean, just a couple of really small points to wrap things up. I do recall Land Space a few years ago having had some emphasis on their side as well about kind of environmentally friendly rockets. And so I do think it's interesting that their former CTO has gone to make environmentally friendly rockets over in Suzhou. The other point that I will mention before calling it a day here is this is now so what we have in Suzhou. In Jiangsu province, we have Deep Blue Aerospace in Nantong doing their rocket manufacturing base, and we have Tianbing in Suzhou. Do we have any others in just Jiangsu province? I don't think
so. I
don't think so, but I still feel like 2 is quite, that's Yeah, and then we have a couple more in Zhejiang, just to the south. So there's going to be a lot of rocket companies in the Yangtze River Delta, is what it comes down to. So we'll be here to report about them. So that being said, Jean, anything else from your side this week, or are we all good?
I'm all good.
Great. Well, this has been another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup for the week of the 19th to 25th of April, 2021. I'm Blaine Curcio, joined as always by my co-host, Jean Deville. Thank you for listening or watching, and have a good rest of your week.
Thanks for watching. Bye.